to know at the moment. But are they not all different?
Well, I try to argue that the distinction between a natural and a man-made disaster, which seems intuitive, is actually very misleading. On the one side, we think of earthquakes, or for that matter, pandemics, as natural disasters, and wars or financial crises as man-made or people-made, I should probably say these days, though most wars certainly have been caused by men. But on close inspection, it's not quite clear that the distinction works. Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, many years ago pointed out that famines were not natural disasters, that they might originate in a crop failure, but it took human agency to cause mass starvation. He cited the examples of the famines in Ireland in the 19th century, in India in the 19th and 20th centuries, in China in the 1950s, and argued that ultimately famines happen because either of an economic mismanagement or a fundamental political mismanagement or deliberate political intent in the case of Mao Zedong's famine or Stalin's famines. And therefore we should stop thinking about famines as natural. We should think of them as man-made. And I remember thinking as the pandemic was unfolding, well, why isn't the same true of a pandemic? Why isn't it ultimately a matter of politics that decides how disastrous the advent of a new pathogen is? And we can see, looking back on the past year and a half, that the same virus has caused very, very different outcomes in different countries. In Taiwan, they only recently got into treble figures in terms of deaths. It's something like 135. Up until a very recent outbreak, there were fewer than 20 deaths from COVID in the whole country, whereas, of course, in the United States, we're approaching 600,000. These outcomes are very, very divergent and can't, I think, be explained in purely biological terms. Ultimately, we mishandled the outbreak of this pandemic, and other countries handled it much better. So the conclusion of the book is that we should stop drawing this distinction. Ultimately, it's a matter of human agency how many people die. And the classic illustration of this that I give you is really geological. Sure, a volcano or an earthquake, these are not things that we control. But if we decide to build large cities right next to zones of geological danger, that too is the politics of catastrophe. And that's why the subtitle of Doom is the politics of catastrophe. To a far greater extent than we probably want to face, every disaster has a political character.
Well, that kind of raises the question, and throughout history, and this is a book is a broad sweep of history, stuff happens. I'm using the polite word there. You use the regular word in the book. And yet humans don't seem to learn from the stuff that happens. Why not? When you look at the pandemic and you're talking about the various ways of perhaps controlling it that were tried in different places, why were there different schemes in different places when, in theory, we've had enough pandemics throughout history that we should know better?
Well, it's true that pandemics have been a feature of history since the earliest recorded history. I mean, Thucydides is writing about a terrible plague that strikes Athens during the Peloponnesian War, and it's a very vivid description that he gives. Plagues or pandemics have been a part of human history from really the outset. The reason that we don't seem to learn from past mistakes is that these things don't happen on a regular, predictable cycle. In fact, they strike quite apparently randomly, and they vary enormously in their scale. Now, most people in the past year and a half have talked as if a pandemic was a novel thing, but in fact, we lived through one already that killed more people than COVID-19 has killed so far, the HIV/AIDS pandemic. But it was a different kind of pandemic. It was a mainly sexually transmitted virus against which it proved impossible to develop a vaccine. 32 million people have died as a result of HIV/AIDS since the disease was first properly identified back in the 1980s. I don't think we're very good at learning from even the recent past. An example of that is there were 2 coronavirus outbreaks in the last 20 years, SARS and MERS. And only, it seems to me, a relatively few governments, Taiwan, South Korea's in particular, learned the significance of those events and understood that if you got a different kind of coronavirus that was less lethal and more transmissible, then we'd be in a very different situation from in previous pandemics. We in the West were basically ready for an influenza pandemic, because we've had lots of experience of those going back to the 19th century. And the worst pandemic in the last century or so was an influenza pandemic in 1918-19. We didn't really prepare for a new SARS. And that's one reason that we were caught flat-footed at the beginning of 2020. So I do think one of the reasons that we bungle disasters is that we're not very good at learning from history and applying it. And that's strange because, as you say, if there's one thing that we should really be looking out for, it's pandemics. They have been historically the biggest killers. Probably the worst disaster to strike humanity in all of recorded history was the Black Death of the 1340s. Well, it struck Europe in the 1340s. It had probably been sweeping slowly across Asia in the previous century, if not decades. But that's the thing we need to worry about. It's actually that which can kill really large percentages of humanity. And after that, the next form of disaster to really worry about is war, because really the world wars are up there in the top 5 of historic disasters. And I don't think we've done that well at learning the lessons of those wars.
Well, how does somebody then identify a potential, actually, let me back up a little bit and throw in a second question here, because you talk about black swans and gray rhinos and dragon kings, and I want you to explain that as part of this answer. But how does somebody identify a gray rhino? Black swan, I guess by definition you wouldn't know, but an event that is likely to happen. George W. Bush read the book Pandemic about the 1918 flu, Spanish flu, and ordered a comprehensive plan developed for how to respond to a pandemic, and yet we got COVID and the book had been thrown away.
Well, credit to President Bush. It's always a bit of a rarity when an elected president or prime minister tries to learn from history, and I might add, reads a book while in office. Now, the problem is that it's not difficult to say there's going to be a pandemic. Dozens of people, some famous, some less so, was saying that over the last 20 or so years. Many people recall Bill Gates' TED Talk on the subject. Larry Brilliant, the epidemiologist, did one. And this is what makes a pandemic a grey rhino. It's something that you can see coming. And nobody should have been surprised by the outbreak of a pandemic. It was eminently predictable. The problem is that preparing for a pandemic is something that you have bureaucratic agencies to do. And that's what they did. They had elaborate pandemic preparedness plans, dozens of them. Multiple agencies were involved in this process. There was a new plan that was being rolled out in 2018. And on paper, the United States was better prepared for such a public health emergency than any other country. And second in rank, according to a 2019 survey, was the United Kingdom. So one of the big puzzles of the last year and a half is why the countries that were on paper the best prepared were amongst the worst performers when it came to containing the outbreak. And the answer that I offer is that bureaucracy can give you the illusion of preparedness. It's not, in fact, enough to have a 36-page pandemic preparedness plan if you haven't really done significant amounts of drills and simulations, if you're just going to wait until it begins to see if the plan works. So I think we had the illusion of preparedness. And one of the really important things we have to learn from the last year and a half is how to substitute real preparedness for this phony preparedness that we had. There's a moment which really startled me when I was researching the book in 2018, after there's a pandemic preparedness plan update in place. When the official responsible for preparedness, I think Robert Cadillac was Deputy Secretary for Preparedness at HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, gives a lecture in Texas in which he says, if we don't have a real effective insurance plan for a pandemic, we'll be SOL if there is one. And I didn't know what SOL stood for, being a simple Briton. And of course, it turns out for expletive deleted out of luck. And so this was the guy whose one job it was, basically acknowledging that the plan wouldn't really work. It would disintegrate on contact with a new pathogen. This seems to me a really important point. Let me add one more beast to the menagerie. You know, things are clearly grey rhinos when we see them approaching. It's funny how they can feel like black swans when they actually happen. Climate change is a bit like this. You know, you've had endless conferences on the subject, and there'll be yet more in the coming years. And yet one suspects that when a really serious climate-related disaster happens, we'll talk about it as if it's completely unprecedented and unforeseeable. So this is a strange peculiarity of human nature, that we're really surprised. We're shocked when something actually happens that we've been talking about for years. But there's a third category, and that's the Dragon King. These are the events that actually do more than just kill a lot of people. Disasters obviously are defined by the body count, but some disasters have consequences that go far beyond the body count. And it's quite hard to predict at the moment of crisis whether that will happen or not. There are some disasters which killed a lot of people, like the Asian influenza of 1957-58, that are largely forgotten. They didn't really have any consequences, and people have more or less cast it into the memory hole. And there are other disasters, and I think here of World War I, that have much greater consequences than just the number of people that they killed. So we still don't quite know if COVID-19 is going to be a dragon king. It was a grey rhino in the sense that we predicted pandemics. It was a black swan in the sense that we were totally blindsided when one actually happened. But I still don't know if it's going to be a historical dragon king with really massive repercussions.
It raises an interesting question about what, over the past year that we've experienced, do you think will continue? This morning, Zoom came out with its earnings, big earnings beat, and great for the stock and everything. But some analysts are saying this is as good as it gets because now the world is opening up again and we can go back to regular meetings. Are we going to be doing a Zoom call with you for your next book, or what else might be a lingering presence from the COVID pandemic?
Well, the Stanford economist Nick Bloom has done some great work on this and was working on the issue of working from home even before the pandemic struck. And his view is that a really quite significant amount of work can continue to be done remotely, and that if you look at how particularly the big tech companies are thinking about this, we're probably heading towards a hybrid world in which we do quite a lot still via platforms such as Zoom, and ration our long-haul flights, ration our in-person meetings. We won't eliminate them altogether in the same way that one learns better in class in the same space. One broadly has better meetings when one's in the same space. But I think we'll want to kind of economize on those real space meetings. So I think there's going to be a fundamental transformation in the nature of work that will persist. You can already see this. It's quite remarkable to look at the mobility data that companies like Google provide. People have definitely reverted to normal when it comes to recreation and consumer behavior. But in the world of work, there has not yet been normalization. People are still at home a lot more than usual, and they are not going to workplaces the way they were doing prior to the pandemic. So this feels like one of those shifts that will stick. And I certainly welcome it because the thought of returning to my old travel schedule fills me with dread. So yeah, long live Zoom. It's a little odd to be talking about doom on Zoom. And I sometimes wonder if I could have called the book Zoom, but no, doom is the subject.
Yes, for those of you who are interested in Niall's former travel agenda, it is in the introduction, and it is, as somebody who spends my life traveling, that is a truly horrifying trip that you were on. We do have questions. We are taking questions in from the audience. If you want to use the Q&A function on Zoom and send us some questions. And we've got one now that sort of follows in what we're talking about now, especially with the idea that different places do things react differently. Somebody asks, will you share your view on cultural and political differences in mitigating catastrophes and in managing them?
A great question, and it's something that the book talks about. I think there's a cliche that says you could do things in Taiwan and South Korea, such as large-scale testing, contact tracing, and efficient isolation of the infected or potentially infected that you couldn't do in the United States or in other Western countries because they're Asians and we're Western, and they have a different approach to issues such as public health that is more collectivist, and we're the great individualists who love freedom too much to submit to a contact tracing system. And I think this is a bit of a delusion, actually, because if you really love freedom, you ought to prefer a contact tracing app to being locked up in your own home for weeks on end. We ended up doing things in the form of lockdowns that were actually much more intrusive and much more restricting on individual freedom than anything they had to do in Taiwan or in South Korea. I think the key here is that we've just been slow to recognize the potential uses of technology in dealing with public health or other crises. The Taiwanese digital minister, Audrey Tang, is one of the heroes of my book, somebody who really pioneers the idea that we can use technology to make citizens feel empowered and government more transparent and accountable. And this is actually something that would fit very well into a liberty-loving Western society. We've just chosen not to go there because I think our bureaucracy is 20 or 30 years behind in terms of the ways in which we can use technology. So I think the cultural differences tend to be slightly overstated. Another typical, I think, wrong view is that, well, some countries had populist leaders and that led to disastrous outcomes. Yeah, I mean, the populist leaders did not do well. There's no question. Donald Trump made numerous mistakes, almost too many to count. But I don't think that's why we've had really high excess mortality in the United States. There were plenty of countries without populist leaders that did even worse in Europe and in Latin America. So I'm a little skeptical of that kind of political take that many people have been writing over the last year and a half.
One feature of Western societies, at least, is the belief in science and the fact that, or the idea that science can fix a lot of things. And while you're critical of bureaucracies, and we can talk more about that in a moment, we came up with vaccines that work really, really well in an astonishingly rapid time, a year when they normally take something like 7 years. Do you think most people sort of look at the idea of catastrophes as something that someone else is going to be able to take care of for us?
Well, one of the really encouraging things about last year was how successfully Western companies came up with really, really high efficacy vaccines. And when I was finishing the book, that still wasn't certain because the phase 3 results hadn't yet been published. My hunch was, though, that the Western vaccines would be better than the Chinese vaccines. And that's turned out to be very right indeed. We're just ahead technologically. mRNA vaccines are only produced in the West, thanks to companies like Moderna in the United States and BioNTech in Germany. The great news is that science really works. But when I say science, I don't mean the science. There is not one settled truth about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. On the contrary, there's a process, an ongoing process of massive collaborative research in multiple disciplines. And it was very impressive to watch that process working. It generates a fire hose of research. It's almost impossible for any one person to keep track of it all. But as I did my best to do that last year, what most impressed me was that we still have an extraordinarily vibrant set of global science communities and institutions that promote that kind of research. And the best of those institutions are still very clearly in the United States and in a small number of European countries. So that's the good news. The bad news is that even as we advance scientifically, and we've been doing that pretty steadily since the 19th century in our understanding of a whole range of different threats that we face, not only from pathogens, but from other sources, we also have been making ourselves more vulnerable. And that's happened in two ways. First, we've become far more mobile as a species. As well as more numerous, we also travel much, much more. And so by 2019, there really were unprecedented volumes of traffic, conveying people from Wuhan to airports all over the world. At the same time, we've built a network, the internet, for spreading information that turns out to be really good at spreading misinformation and disinformation. So although the science or the sciences have been advancing, I'm not sure our collective understanding of science has been doing the same thing. And one can see that in debates in the United States and elsewhere over vaccines. Ordinary people seem unable to understand that the risk from COVID-19 as a disease is far, far greater than the risk from a vaccine. And that is leading to vaccine hesitancy, which of course is making it harder to get to herd immunity and beat the disease. So it feels a little bit like we take 2 steps forward in our scientific understanding and 1 or 1.5 steps back in terms of our vulnerability and our general comprehension of the threats that we face.
Speaking of vulnerability, you mention in the book that the larger disasters, or at least more vulnerable to disaster, are Asian countries. And yet we also had the pandemics that came to the New World from Europe when the New World was discovered that wiped out an awful lot of indigenous people. And I'm wondering, there's an old question for history professors, is geography destiny? And I'm wondering if that's true in the case of disasters as well.
It is to some extent. If you just look at the distribution of population around the world, a very significant proportion of the Asian population lives close to fault lines and places of significant volcanic activity. It also seems pretty clear from the historical data that natural disasters such as floods or droughts are more likely to kill large numbers of Asians than really large numbers of people in North America, partly because it's less densely settled here, but it's also because from a climatic point of view, there's greater vulnerability. So I make the point that the Great Asian Disaster historically has tended to be a couple of orders of magnitude larger than its equivalent, whether you're talking about floods or earthquakes, or for that matter, wildfires. Things are just more disastrous in Asia because by and large, there are larger centers of population close to the place at which the disaster occurs. And that means that when you turn to the issue of climate change, it is not going to be a fair world. The costs of climate change are not going to be evenly distributed. Some parts of the world are going to suffer significantly more. And that's not just the low-lying coastal regions I'm talking about. It's pretty obvious that the way things are going, parts of sub-Saharan Africa will become far less able to support agriculture. And that's going to lead to great population movements in the coming decades. So geography is quite a large part of destiny. And so, of course, is demographics. But it's only really a part. And we shouldn't become fatalistic about this, because if there's one thing I've learned from my career as an historian, it's the way in which cultures or nations can change their behaviors if the incentives are appropriately adjusted. And so we shouldn't simply say to ourselves, we can't do better because we're just the way we are. History tells us that we can actually change the way we do things quite drastically if we honestly ask what went wrong. One example of this is that the United States changed its way of waging war after Vietnam because the US military took a long, hard look at what had gone wrong in the 60s and 70s and radically reformed itself. I think post-COVID, we're going to have to do something somewhat similar for our public health bureaucracy, which is in some ways suffering from some of the syndromes that the military suffered from in Vietnam: excessive bureaucratization, a tendency to concentrate power in the center. Think of the way that the Centers for Disease Control completely screwed up testing, which was crucial to containing the outbreak at the beginning. And we couldn't do it because we had no testing capacity. And that wasn't the fault of Donald Trump. That was the fault of CDC, which not only prevented other people developing tests, but also produced its own test that didn't work.
Let me follow on by asking a little bit more about now some of these natural disasters that we're talking about, because we've talked about the pandemics, but in terms of earthquakes, in terms of volcanoes, floods, fires, you draw a picture of what you call the fractal geometry of disaster. Can you explain that?
Well, I wanted to focus the book on the big disasters in history, the ones that killed a lot of people. But I wanted also to spend a little time, and this is what one chapter does, looking at smaller scale disasters that nevertheless offer clues as to the nature of disaster. The thing about disaster is that it comes in this very, very uneven distribution. There's not an average disaster. There isn't an average earthquake, an average wildfire, or an average pandemic. Many of these forms of disaster are distributed according to power laws, not across a bell curve. And that means you get a very few massive disasters and lots of really quite small ones. And we need to learn something from the smaller disasters too. I offer a thought from Tolstoy, borrowed really from Tolstoy, that all disasters are a bit like happy families. They're all kind of the same. It doesn't really matter what kind of disaster you're talking about. There usually turns out to be some point of failure in the human response, and it isn't necessarily at the top. So this is what drew me to look closely at famous disasters like the Titanic or the Space Shuttle Challenger. By comparison with pandemics and wars, not many people died. And the Titanic was not the costliest loss at sea in terms of people drowned by any means. The Space Shuttle Challenger only killed 7 people, its crew, when it blew up. But it was a disaster that kind of scarred the national consciousness because so many people watched that launch not expecting the thing to blow up just seconds after takeoff. So I wanted to delve into those disasters because it struck me that I probably could learn something from looking at these smaller disasters. And the idea of fractal geometry is that the disasters have similar qualities regardless of scale, that a really huge disaster and a small disaster have certain things in common. And I'll give you just one example. When I delved into the history of the Space Shuttle Challenger, I discovered, fascinatingly, that the initial response of the media was to try to blame Ronald Reagan, the president, by arguing that the Space Shuttle launch had been rushed because Reagan wanted to mention it in his State of the Union. But that turned out to be entirely untrue. There'd never been any intent to use the launch for political purposes. The real reason that the Challenger blew up was that while the engineers at NASA knew there was a 1% chance that it would blow up, that had been turned into 1 in 100,000 by NASA bureaucrats who didn't want to admit to the people funding the space shuttle program that it was so dangerous. I'm fascinated by that kind of point of failure where the engineers know, but somewhere in middle management, there is the enigmatic figure of Mr. Kingsbury, who's the figure that kind of constantly makes this change, making sure that correct information doesn't reach the place that it should reach. That kind of thing seems to me to happen in most disasters, whether they're military or natural. And I suspect that there's a kind of Mr. Kingsbury figure somewhere at CDC who's the reason why testing was screwed up in early 2020.
Yeah, it seems that, as you say in the book, you have complex systems, and then one thing goes wrong that leads to others, a small perturbation, as you say. Is that kind of the lesson of the disasters that you've studied, that it isn't just a simple thing that happens, it's a complex cascade of items?
Yeah, everything from the weather to the US federal government is a complex system. And that means that they're really quite hard to understand. Even if you try to model them, you'll struggle to capture all the non-linearities. And in particular, you'll struggle to capture the way a relatively small shock can cause the whole system to tip over into chaos. This is the famous butterfly effect that Edward Lorenz talked about many years ago. And I think that's why it's so hard to predict the timing of a disaster. And it's, in fact, probably futile to try to do that because we just don't know. We couldn't have said last year, or rather the year before, when exactly a new coronavirus would emerge that was very transmissible because people infected with it weren't initially symptomatic. that was a possibility, but there was no way of knowing when that would happen or where it would happen. So preparedness has to, I think, be really about nimbleness. You're not going to prophesy the next pandemic. You're not going to have any real clue about its timing, nor will you really know what kind of pandemic it is. So the key is to have very rapid reaction in your public health bureaucracy, and that's what we lacked. What to me was just amazing last year was how there was dithering January, February into mid-March on both sides of the Atlantic. It was as if people were unable to make decisions and take preemptive action. And in fact, that's just what you need to do at the beginning of an emergency. You have to be very quick on the draw. Let me give you an example from a completely different domain, financial crisis. Now, we all know that on paper, banks were actually regulated in 2008. In fact, the regulations of bank capital adequacy had become quite voluminous in the form of the Basel regulations. And there were national regulations too. And yet it was banks that blew up the world economy in 2008, beginning with investment banks. If you look back on that crisis, it seems to me what really differentiated institutions was their speed of response. I remember Lloyd Blankfein, who was then chief executive of Goldman Sachs, saying to me, we weren't any smarter than the other investment banks in seeing this coming, but when it began, we were quicker. In the same way, Ben Bernanke was a key figure in the response to the crisis, partly because he was the quickest on the FOMC, on the Federal Open Markets Committee, to see that the US was on the brink of another Great Depression. And that was partly because he'd studied history and knew what Great Depressions looked like in their opening phase. So I think what we need to inculcate in private sector and public sector organizations is learn from history, but be quick on the draw. Because with something like a pandemic, you really have a few weeks to contain it. If you don't act in those few weeks, you will be overwhelmed by a contagious virus.
And yet, we know this, but then you look at the great financial crisis, you look at COVID, countries go their own way. Why are they so reluctant to ask for help or to cooperate across international lines when obviously you're talking about an international disaster?
Well, we're still failing in that sense. I mean, we're here to talk a little bit about global interdependence and global cooperation. Well, what a failure there's been. At times, right at the beginning, it looked like what the French call sauve qui peut, every man for himself. Even the European countries were in an undignified fight over protective gear. Right now, the world faces an open-ended calamity because we cannot figure out a global vaccination strategy. And that means that large parts of the developing world are still in the grip of the pandemic, giving the virus great opportunities to continue to mutate. So I think we have to look back and accept that there's been a major failure of international cooperation. And part of the problem lies with the World Health Organization, which did a shockingly bad job. And it didn't always perform so badly. If one looks back at how the WHO played the original SARS epidemic, 2003, its role was far more effective, not least because it stood up to the Chinese government and applied real pressure on Beijing. This time around, I'm afraid the WHO was very soft in its handling of Beijing, and it continues, I think, to fail to get straight answers from the Chinese government about what originally happened in Wuhan at the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020. So I think the WHO is in need of a serious overhaul, and we also need to think very hard about how the vaccination strategy is unfolded. There was a huge success in a few Western countries, principally the UK and the US as well as Israel. But ultimately, it's not enough for us to vaccinate our people if the rest of the world lags far behind, because there's going to be a vaccine evading mutant at some point if we're not quicker. So this is a very, very important takeaway. And it applies to other domains too. In theory, we know that the problem of climate change requires global cooperation. But if you think the Paris Accord delivers that, then I have a bridge and a couple of solar panels to sell you. Because in practice, CO2 emissions have continued to rise since the Paris Accord, and nearly half, 48% of the increase, is due to China. About a fifth is due to India, and the rest is the Middle East. So we're going about our business, trying to do Green New Deals and reduce our emissions, it's all completely futile if the rest of the world, in particular the big Asian countries, don't do their bit. And I'm very much afraid that we've reached the point at which, unless we come up with some way of constraining China, and to some extent India too, then we are going to get the worst case scenario as projected by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because they're just not doing what they need to do.
We thank you for the pitch for the Global Interdependence Center and its work in this situation. You mentioned that people can't time disasters or predict them. There are certainly some quasi-religious groups that would disagree with you, and one of our audience members would like to know if you've heard from anyone who predicts the end of the world after your book.
Well, it's not only religious figures who predict the end of the world. I mean, it's only 2 years ago that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Democratic Congresswoman, said the world would end in 12 years if we didn't address the problem of climate change. I guess it's down to 10 years now. But the idea that the end is nigh is very appealing, even to people who are not devout Christians or Muslims. And this is the strange phenomenon of secular millenarianism. People who anticipate the end of the world and say they're doing so on the basis of science, but actually aren't really doing that at all. So I think that the problem, and I try to sketch it in the book, is that we're fascinated by this notion of an apocalypse. It permeates our thinking, even if we are entirely secular, just in the same way that it was a part and parcel of Marxism. Marx's prediction in Capital is this catastrophe when capitalism collapses. And when you read the relevant paragraphs, it's kind of lifted from the book of Revelation, but just with the wording changed. So we are really attracted to this notion of the end time. It's a big part of many strands of Christianity and Islam. And what I try to argue in the book is that that's not really the thing we should worry about, that it's really quite hard to imagine complete annihilation in the relatively short term. It's easy to imagine lots of medium to small disasters. And those are the things we need to get better at dealing with. I mean, excess mortality like we saw in the US in 2020, we have not seen since 1918. That is a lot of people who died prematurely. And we need to recognize that that's our problem, dealing with that kind of threat and making sure that doesn't happen again on a regular basis. The questioner asked if I'd had any feedback from religious bodies. None at all.
The question then becomes, as the Linda Hunt character said in Year of Living Dangerously, what then must we do? If we see a world, if we read the book and we're convinced by you that something must be done, what can people do? And the reason I ask it this way is you talk about the political dimension of catastrophes, the fact that people build and live along earthquake zones. Well, the author of Doom lives in California along a major fault line. How do you square that with what you know about the world, and then what can people do about that?
Well, we can't avoid disaster and we can't predict disaster. All we know is that at some point there will be a much larger earthquake on the San Andreas Fault than there has been in over 100 years. The question, it seems to me, is have we got a preparedness plan that will actually work? I mean, I'm sure we have a preparedness plan in Sacramento, and it probably is at least 36 pages long. But so was the pandemic preparedness plan, and that turned out to be pretty useless. So we need to make sure that we have plans that will work. To make a plan work, you need to drill, you need to simulate, and you need to practice. I've been in California for 4.5 years. I can honestly say I've been involved in 0 drills or simulations. Neither in the workplace nor at home have we really seriously asked ourselves how we would cope if that disaster struck. Now, you can do only so much on your own. Preppers, as they sit there with their canned food and ammunition, don't really stand a great chance if they're acting completely in isolation. So my advice is you also need to think locally, and certainly in our road, where I live, we spend a lot of time talking about this, but I still feel uneasily that talking is not the same as practicing. Same applies to wildfires. We had a terrible wildfire season last year. For sure, there will be a worse one at some point because California is just one great massive kindling ready to go up in smoke because for years there hasn't been adequate controlled burning. So I don't think we can do anything other than scrutinize the plans that exist and ask the question, will these actually work? Drill and actually practice in the same way that the military does more than just draw up plans. You know, they do that, but they also know, at least all good soldiers know, the plan disintegrates on contact with the enemy. And after that, you're only as good as your training. And then try to make sure that at the local level, you have some kind of game plan for when disaster strikes, whether it is an earthquake or a wildfire or something else that you perhaps attach a low probability to, but could still happen.
One of your central theses in the book is the role of social network structure in helping create disasters, but also, I guess, we could look to that to mitigate. And of course, nowadays, when we think of social networks, we think of the internet. How do you put that to work for the good of those who may be doomed?
Well, I think we can see from the Taiwanese example that there are lots of ways that we can use technology more intelligently than we do in the United States. Ways of gathering and sharing information that we really just didn't bother to use. I give you the example of contact tracing. There's no really effective contact tracing in the United States to this day, despite the fact that it obviously works. Even in the UK, they finally got a contact tracing app up and running. And it turns out, on the basis of a new paper that just came out, that it really worked quite well once it got going. So I think there's partly just a need to think more creatively about using technology for public problems. After all, the companies, the big tech companies, have the data. They have more data on us than they probably have on the citizens of any other country. But what's odd to me is that at no point last year was that enormous trove of data put to any public use. And I do think it's one of the oddities of 2020 that contact tracing was essentially punted by Google and Apple to state governments. And they must have known that state governments wouldn't be able to do it. So I think we need to ask some questions about what the tech companies didn't do to help in this crisis. Also, what they did that hurt us. Let's face it, the conspiracy theories weren't being spread by chain letters. They were being spread online in Facebook groups and in on other platforms. And those did a great deal of harm and continue, I think, to do harm in discouraging people from getting vaccinated. But let me add one final point on this. If we build our emergency responses on the internet, what do we do when the internet goes down? A big challenge, in my view, which is probably quite imminent, will come when there's a successful large-scale cyber attack on the United States that takes out a significant amount of critical infrastructure and potentially shuts down the internet for at least a period of time. I'm not sure there are many organizations that have really thought through how they would function if there suddenly were no Zoom, no email, and no websites. So we've got to make sure that we actually can cope if even only temporarily we have a complete shutdown of our online communication systems. Let's face it, we know from the recent cases of Colonial Pipeline, we are very vulnerable to those attacks. We're a very open society. Most organizations don't have very good internet security, and our enemies know it. And they've been more or less signaling their intent to use cyber in a very offensive way in the event of a conventional conflict. So that's on my list of things to worry about in the near term that could happen much faster than climate change.
Well, that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about, the idea of a cyber attack. How would you put that in context to the other dooms that we face? A lot of them cost lives in a sort of massive, quick way. Here we're talking about lack of heat, as we saw in Texas, or maybe the money doesn't come out of the ATMs, commerce shuts down. Where would that fall in the pantheon of disasters?
It's hard to know what the body count would be if you had a significant internet outage, but it wouldn't be zero, because a significant part of our health infrastructure would be compromised. If you had a really major grid outage, if electricity was down for a significant period of time, it'd be curtains for the people in intensive care. to give just one obvious example. Then there's the broader question of social order. How well would that hold up if there was a complete communications blackout? So I think we need to take this seriously as something that would be life-threatening, and potentially very seriously life-threatening if it were prolonged. I wonder if we do have the kind of robust response in place, even at the level of our national security institutions. There's an awful lot of dependence on electronic communications now built into how our military operates. And if you read some of the recent, admittedly fictional attempts to imagine the war of the future, like Jim Stavridis's new book, 2034, or The Ghost Fleet, an earlier novel that imagines World War III, it's striking that cyber operations are really pretty crucial to a Chinese-Russian attack on the United States. And we have a great many vulnerabilities, not least because of the way in which defense procurement works. Our software in the military is actually somewhat behind our software in the private sector. And therefore, there are probably a great many vulnerabilities in the software that's being used, as well as in the hardware that's being used by the military. So I think this is something to worry about way more than we currently do. And it's another grey rhino that we can see coming towards us, where the cyber attacks and the private sector institutions like Colonial are telling us, hey, this is the trailer, but the movie is going to be much, much bigger.
Let me end with another question from the audience that is very timely, because as you're no doubt aware, a group of historians signed a paper yesterday suggesting that American democracy is in real trouble. And the audience member wants to know, are there real issues with democracies in the world or governments in the world that are in danger of failing, and how that plays into the idea of responding to crises, preparing for crises?
One of the great strengths of American democracy is that we've been worrying about its durability almost since the founding. Remember Benjamin Franklin's great response, a republic if you can keep it. And I think it's healthy that we should worry about potential threats to the democratic system. On the other hand, I don't think one should start talking about the United States as if it's the Weimar Republic, as if it's the German Republic that collapsed with the rise of Hitler. I've been arguing since, I think, 2015 that populism has quite some deep roots in American political history. You don't need to look at 1930s Europe to understand what's going on in the US today, and to understand what motivates Trump supporters and continues to make them frustrated with the various things that they take umbrage against, whether it's free trade or political correctness or illegal immigration. Those issues are not going to go away. And I predict that there will be a revival of conservatism in the coming years, despite the fact that the economy is going to have a very strong year. It's not going to make those bugbears go away. But I do think there's a slight tendency on the American left to exaggerate the threat posed to American democracy, whether it's by white supremacist groups, which I think are in fact pretty small in terms of their numbers, or the Republican Party more generally. I mean, in the end, clearly there were attempts to subvert the electoral process at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, culminating in the storming of the Capitol. But what impressed me most was, in fact, that Republican officials in the key states where the counts were being challenged held firm and really dismissed the attempts of the Trump campaign to challenge what had happened. So we didn't really end up in a rerun of the 2000 situation, because the truth was it just wasn't close for that to be viable. Could that be different in 2024? I mean, it could conceivably, but my sense is that between now and then, a lot's going to happen. And if I had to bet, it would be that Trump himself will fade from the scene, as people tend to once they're denied the oxygen of publicity for long enough. And politics will probably revert to something more familiar, just as it did in the election result that produced the Biden administration. So I'm one of those people who's been saying chill about American politics since 2015. And although it got a little bit nail-biting when the Capitol was occupied by a mob, I still think the system turned out to be very resilient indeed, and will continue to be so.
We have one last question from someone who I guess is trying to time the next disaster and make sure it doesn't happen until you release the second volume of the Kissinger biography, and they want to know when that's going to be.
Well, I'm working on it now. It was a bit of distracting last year, which was one reason that I wrote Doom, and it should be published no later than 2023 to coincide with the great man's centenary.
Niall Ferguson, thank you very much for joining us today with the Global Interdependence Center, spending time with us, a fascinating conversation. We wish you the best of luck with the book, which again, I would note you can get at a discount through Word bookstores with the coupon code DOOM20, and you can find a link to the code on the GIC website. Thank you very much for joining us today, Niall.
Thank you, Michael.
And we do want to point out that our next executive briefing will be on June 22nd. It will focus on the economics of food security during crises, and registration for that is now available on the GIC website. A replay of today's executive briefing will be available on the GIC website tomorrow. To find the video replays or to explore GIC membership, donate to GIC, or find details on how to get that coupon for Doom, please visit the GIC's website. It's www.interdependence.org. Remember, it is .org. That is important on the end. As we conclude, we encourage you to take 60 seconds to respond to our audience survey. Feedback is important to us. We appreciate you letting us know how we can improve our programming. Thank you very much for your attention. Have a great day. I'm Michael McKee for the Global Interdependence Center.